The Dream by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. Dreams! What age or what country of the world has not felt and acknowledged the mystery of their origin and end? I have thought not a little upon the subject, which has been often forced upon my attention, and sometimes strangely enough, and yet I have never arrived at anything which at all appeared a satisfactory conclusion. It does appear that a mental phenomenon so extraordinary cannot be wholly without its use. We know indeed that in the olden times it has been made the organ of communication between the deity and his creatures. And when a dream produces upon a mind, to all appearance hopelessly reprobate and depraved, an effect so powerful and so lasting as to break down the inveterate habits and to reform the life of an abandoned sinner, we see in the result, in the reformation of morals which appeared incorrigible, in the reclamation of a human soul which seemed to be irretrievably lost, something more than could be produced by a mere chimera of the slumbering fancy, something more than could arise from the capricious images of a terrified imagination. And while reason rejects as absurd the superstition which will read a prophecy in every dream, she may, without violence to herself, recognize, even in the wildest and most incongruous of the wanderings of a slumbering intellect, the evidences and the fragments of a language which may be spoken, which has been spoken, to terrify, to warn, and to command. We have reason to believe, too, by the promptness of action which in the age of the prophets followed all intimations of this kind, and by the strength of conviction and strange permanence of the effects resulting from certain dreams in latter times, which effects we ourselves may have witnessed, that when this medium of communication has been employed by the deity, the evidences of his presence have been unequivocal. My thoughts were directed to this subject in a manner to leave a lasting impression upon my mind, by the events which I shall now relate, the statement of which, however extraordinary, is nevertheless accurate. About the year 17-something, having been appointed to the living of C.H., I rented a small house in the town which bears the same name. One morning in the month of November I was awakened before my usual time by my servant, who bustled into my bedroom for the purpose of announcing a sick call. As the Catholic Church holds her last rites to be totally indispensable to the safety of the departing sinner, no conscientious clergyman can afford a moment's unnecessary delay, and in little more than 5 minutes I stood ready, cloaked and booted for the road, in the small front parlour in which the messenger who was to act as my guide awaited my coming. I found a poor little girl crying piteously near the door, and after some slight difficulty I ascertained that her father was either dead or just dying. "And what may be your father's name, my poor child?" said I. She held down her head as if ashamed. I repeated the question, and the wretched little creature burst into floods of tears still more bitter than she had shed before. At length, almost angered by conduct which appeared to me so unreasonable, I began to lose patience, and I said rather harshly, "If you will not tell me the name of the person to whom you would lead me, your silence can arise from no good motive, and I might be justified in refusing to go with you at all."
"Oh, don't say that,
cried she.
"Oh, sir, it was that I was afeard of when I would not tell you. I was afeard when you heard his name you would not come with me. But it is no use hiding it now. It's Pat Connell, the carpenter, your honour."
She looked in my face with the most earnest anxiety, as if her very existence depended upon what she should read there. I relieved the child at once. The name, indeed, was most unpleasantly familiar to me, but however fruitless my visits and advice might have been at another time, the present was too fearful an occasion to suffer my doubts of their utility, or my reluctance to reattempting what appeared a hopeless task, to weigh even against the lightest chance that a consciousness of his imminent danger might produce in him a more docile and tractable disposition. Accordingly, I told the child to lead the way and followed her in silence. She hurried rapidly through the long narrow street which forms the great thoroughfare of the town. The darkness of the hour, rendered still deeper by the close approach of the old-fashioned houses which lowered in tall obscurity on either side of the way, the damp, dreary chill which renders the advance of morning peculiarly cheerless, combined with the object of my walk, to visit the deathbed of a presumptuous sinner, to endeavour, almost against my own conviction, to infuse a hope into the heart of a dying reprobate, a drunkard, but too probably perishing under the consequences of some mad fit of intoxication. All these circumstances served to enhance the gloom and solemnity of my feelings, as I silently followed my little guide, who with quick steps traversed the uneven pavement of the main street. After a walk of about 5 minutes, she turned off into a narrow lane of that obscure and comfortless class which is to be found in almost all small old-fashioned towns. Chill, without ventilation, reeking with all manner of offensive effluviae, and lined by dingy, smoky, sickly and pent-up buildings, frequently not only in a wretched, but in a dangerous condition. Your father has changed his abode since I last visited him, and I'm afraid much for the worst, said I.
Indeed he has, sir, but we must not complain,
replied she.
We have to thank God that we have lodging and food, though it's poor enough it is, your honour.
Poor child, thought I. How many an older head might learn wisdom from thee! How many a luxurious philosopher who is skilled to preach but not to suffer! Might not thy patient words put to the blush? The manner and language of my companion were alike above her years and station, and indeed in all cases in which the cares and sorrows of life have anticipated their usual date, and have fallen, as they sometimes do, with melancholy prematurity to the lot of childhood, I have observed the result to have proved uniformly the same. A young mind, to which joy and indulgence have been strangers, and to which suffering and self-denial have been familiarized from the first, acquires a solidity and an elevation which no other discipline could have bestowed, and which, in the present case, communicated a striking but mournful peculiarity to the manners, even to the voice, of the child. We paused before a narrow crazy door, which she opened by means of a latch, and we forthwith began to ascend the steep and broken stairs which led to the sick man's room. As we mounted flight after flight towards the garret floor, I heard more and more distinctly the hurried talking of many voices. I could also distinguish the low sobbing of a female. On arriving upon the uppermost lobby, these sounds became fully audible.
This way, your honour,
said my little conductress. At the same time, pushing open a door of patched and half-rotten plank, she admitted me into the squalid chamber of death and misery. But one candle, held in the fingers of a scared and haggard-looking child, was burning in the room, and that so dim that all was twilight or darkness except within its immediate influence. The general obscurity, however, served to throw into prominent and startling relief the deathbed and its occupant. The light fell with horrible clearness upon the blue and swollen features of the drunkard. I did not think it possible that a human countenance could look so terrific. The lips were black and drawn apart, the teeth were firmly set, the eyes a little unclosed, and nothing but the whites appearing. Every feature was fixed and livid, and the whole face wore a ghastly and rigid expression of despairing terror such as I never saw equalled. His hands were crossed upon his breast and firmly clenched, while, as if to add to the corpse-like effect of the whole, some white cloths dipped in water were wound about the forehead and temples. As soon as I could remove my eyes from this horrible spectacle, I observed my friend Dr. D, one of the most humane of a humane profession, standing by the bedside. He had been attempting, but unsuccessfully, to bleed the patient, and had now applied his finger to the pulse. "Is there any hope?" I inquired in a whisper. A shake of the head was the reply. There was a pause while he continued to hold the wrist, but he waited in vain for the throb of life. It was not there, and when he let go the hand it fell stiffly back into its former position upon the other. "The man is dead," said the physician, as he turned from the bed where the terrible figure lay. Dead, thought I, scarcely venturing to look upon the tremendous and revolting spectacle. Dead, without an hour for repentance, even a moment for reflection. Dead, without the rights which even the best should have. Was there a hope for him? The glaring eyeball, the grinning mouth, the distorted brow, that unutterable look in which a painter would have sought to embody the fixed despair of the nethermost hell. These were my answer. The poor wife sat at a little distance, crying as if her heart would break. The younger children clustered round the bed, looking with wondering curiosity upon the form of death, never seen before. When the first tumult of uncontrollable sorrow had passed away, availing myself of the solemnity and impressiveness of the scene, I desired the heart-stricken family to accompany me in prayer, and all knelt down while I solemnly and fervently repeated some of those prayers which appeared most applicable to the occasion. I employed myself thus in a manner which I trusted was not unprofitable, at least to the living, for about 10 minutes, and having accomplished my task, I was the first to arise. I looked upon the poor, sobbing, helpless creatures who knelt so humbly around me, and my heart bled for them. With a natural transition, I turned my eyes from them to the bed in which the body lay, and, great God! What was the revulsion, the horror which I experienced on seeing the corpse-like terrific thing seated half upright before me! The white cloths which had been wound about the head had now partly slipped from their position, and were hanging in grotesque festoons about the face and shoulders, while the distorted eyes leered from amid them. A sight to dream of, not to tell. I stood actually riveted to the spot. The figure nodded its head and lifted its arm, I thought, with a menacing gesture. 1,000 confused and horrible thoughts at once rushed upon my mind. I had often read that the body of a presumptuous sinner who, during life, had been the willing creature of every satanic impulse, had been known, after the human tenant had deserted it, to become the horrible sport of demoniac possession. I was roused by the piercing scream of the mother, who now, for the first time, perceived the change which had taken place. She rushed towards the bed, but, stunned by the shock and overcome by the conflict of violent emotions, before she reached it, she fell prostrate upon the floor. I am perfectly convinced that had I not been startled from the torpidity of horror in which I was bound by some powerful and arousing stimulant, I should have gazed upon this unearthly apparition until I had fairly lost my senses. As it was, however, the spell was broken. Superstition gave way to reason. The man whom all believed to have been actually dead was living. Dr. D was instantly standing by the bedside, and upon examination he found that a sudden and copious flow of blood had taken place from the wound which the lancet had left, and this, no doubt, had effected his sudden and almost preternatural restoration to an existence from which all thought he had been for ever removed. The man was still speechless, but he seemed to understand the physician when he forbade his repeating the painful and fruitless attempts which he made to articulate, and he at once resigned himself quietly into his hands. I left the patient with leeches upon his temples and bleeding freely, apparently with little of the drowsiness which accompanies apoplexy. Indeed, Dr. D told me that he had never before witnessed a seizure which seemed to combine the symptoms of so many kinds, and yet which belonged to none of the recognized classes. It certainly was not apoplexy, catalepsy, nor delirium tremens, and yet it seemed in some degree to partake of the properties of all. It was strange, but stranger things are coming. During 2 or 3 days Dr. D would not allow his patient to converse in a manner which could excite or exhaust him with anyone. He suffered him merely as briefly as possible to express his immediate wants, and it was not until the 4th day after my early visit, the particulars of which I have just detailed, that it was thought expedient that I should see him, and then only because it appeared that his extreme importunity and impatience to meet me were likely to retard his recovery more than the mere exhaustion attendant upon a short conversation could possibly do. Perhaps, too, my friend entertained some hope that if by holy confession his patient's bosom were eased of the perilous stuff which no doubt oppressed it, his recovery would be more assured and rapid. It was then, as I have said, upon the 4th day after my first professional call, that I found myself once more in the dreary chamber of want and sickness. The man was in bed and appeared low and restless. On my entering the room he raised himself in the bed and muttered twice or thrice, "Thank God! Thank God!" I signed to those of his family who stood by to leave the room, and took a chair beside the bed. So soon as we were alone, he said rather doggedly, "There's no use in telling me of the sinfulness of bad ways. I know it all. I know where they lead to. I have seen everything about it with my own eyesight, as plain as I see you." He rolled himself in the bed as if to hide his face in the clothes, and then suddenly raising himself he exclaimed with startling vehemence, "Look, sir, there is no use in mincing the matter. I'm blasted with the fires of hell. I have been in hell. What do you think of that? In hell? I'm lost forever. I have not a chance. I am damned already. Damned! Damned!" The end of his sentence was actually shouted. His vehemence was perfectly terrific. He threw himself back and laughed and sobbed hysterically. I poured some water into a teacup and gave it to him. After he had swallowed it, I told him if he had anything to communicate, to do so as briefly as he could, and in a manner as little agitating to himself as possible, threatening at the same time, though I had no intention of doing so, to leave him at once in case he again gave way to such passionate excitement. "It's only foolishness," he continued, "for me to try to thank you for coming to such a villain as myself at all. It's no use for me to wish good to you, or to bless you, for such as me has no blessings to give." I told him that I had but done my duty, and urged him to proceed to the matter which weighed upon his mind. He then spoke nearly as follows. "I came in drunk on Friday night last, and got to my bed here. I don't remember how. Some time in the night it seemed to me I wakened, and feeling uneasy in myself, I got up out of the bed. I wanted the fresh air, but I would not make a noise to open the window, for fear I'd waken the crathers. It was very dark and troublesome to find the door, but at last I did get it, and I groped my way out, and went down as easy as I could. I felt quite sober, and I counted the steps one after another as I was going down, that I might not stumble at the bottom. When I came to the first landing place, God be about as always, the floor it sunk under me, and I went down, down, till the senses almost left me. I do not know how long I was falling, but it seemed to me a great while. When I came rightly to myself at last, I was sitting near the top of a great table, and I could not see the end of it, if it had any, it was so far off. And there was men beyond reckoning sitting down all along by it, at each side, as far as I could see at all. I did not know at first was it in the open air, but there was a close smothering feeling in it that was not natural, and there was a kind of light that my eyesight never saw before, red and unsteady, and I did not see for a long time where it was coming from, until I looked straight up, and then I seen that it came from great balls of blood-coloured fire that were rolling high overhead with a sort of rushing, trembling sound, and I perceived that they shone on the ribs of a great roof of rock that was arched overhead instead of the sky. When I seen this, scarce knowing what I did, I got up and I said, I have no right to be here. I must go. And the man that was sitting at my left hand only smiled and said, Sit down again. You can never leave this place. And his voice was weaker than any child's voice I ever heard. And when he was done speaking, he smiled again. Then I spoke out very loud and bold, and I said, In the name of God, let me out of this bad place. And there was a great man that I did not see before, sitting at the end of the table that I was near, and he was taller than 12 men, and his face was very proud and terrible to look at. And he stood up and stretched out his hand before him, and when he stood up, all that was there, great and small, bowed down with a sighing sound, and a dread came on my heart. And he looked at me, and I could not speak. I felt I was his own, to do what he liked with, for I knew at once who he was. And he said, If you promise to return, you may depart for a season. And the voice he spoke with was terrible and mournful, and the echoes of it went rolling and swelling down the endless cave and mixing with the trembling of the fire overhead, so that when he sat down there was a sound after him all through the place, like the roaring of a furnace. And I said, with all the strength I had, I promise to come back. In God's name let me go. And with that I lost the sight and the hearing of all that was there. And when my senses came to me again, I was sitting in the bed with the blood all over me, and you and the rest praying around the room. Here he paused and wiped away the chill drops which hung upon his forehead. I remained silent for some moments. The vision which he had just described struck my imagination not a little, for this was long before Vathek and the Hall of Elbis had delighted the world, and the description which he gave had, as I received it, all the attractions of novelty, beside the impressiveness which always belongs to the narration of an eye-witness, whether in the body or in the spirit, of the scenes which he describes. There was something, too, in the stern horror with which the man related these things, and in the incongruity of his description with the vulgarly received notions of the great place of punishment, and of its presiding spirit, which struck my mind with awe, almost with fear. At length he said with an expression of horrible imploring earnestness which I shall never forget,
Well, sir, is there any hope? Is there any chance at all? Or is my soul pledged and promised away forever? Is it gone out of my power? Must I go back to the place?
In answering him I had no easy task to perform, for however clear might be my internal conviction of the groundlessness of his fears, and however strong my scepticism respecting the reality of what he had described, I nevertheless felt that his impression to the contrary, and his humility and terror resulting from it, might be made available as no mean engines in the work of his conversion from profligacy, and of his restoration to decent habits and to religious feeling. I therefore told him that he was to regard his dream rather in the light of a warning than in that of a prophecy, that our salvation depended not upon the word or deed of a moment, but upon the habits of life, that, in fine, if he at once discarded his idle companions and evil habits, and firmly adhered to a sober, industrious, and religious course of life, the powers of darkness might claim his soul in vain, or that there were higher and firmer pledges than human tongue could utter, which promised salvation to him who should repent and lead a new life. I left him much comforted, and with a promise to return upon the next day. I did so, and found him much more cheerful, and without any remains of the dogged sullenness which I suppose had arisen from his despair. His promises of amendment were given in that tone of deliberate earnestness which belongs to deep and solemn determination, and it was with no small delight that I observed, after repeated visits, that his good resolutions, so far from failing, did but gather strength by time. And when I saw that man shake off the idle and debauched companions whose society had for years formed alike his amusement and his ruin, and revive his long discarded habits of industry and sobriety, I said within myself, there is something more in all this than the operation of an idle dream. One day, some time after his perfect restoration to health, I was surprised on ascending the stairs for the purpose of visiting this man, to find him busily employed in nailing down some planks upon the landing place, through which, at the commencement of his mysterious vision, it seemed to him that he had sunk. I perceived at once that he was strengthening the floor with a view to securing himself against such a catastrophe, and could scarcely forbear a smile as I bid, God bless his work. He perceived my thoughts, I suppose, for he immediately said, I can never pass over that floor without trembling. I'd leave this house if I could, but I can't find another lodging in the town so cheap, and I'll not take a better till I've paid off all my debts, please God. But I could not be easy in my mind till I made it safe as I could. You'll hardly believe me, your honour, that while I'm working, maybe a mile away, my heart is in a flutter the whole way back, with the bare thoughts of the 2 little steps I have to walk upon this bit of a floor. So it's no wonder, sir, I'd try to make it sound and firm with any idle timber I have. I applauded his resolution to pay off his debts, and the steadiness with which he pursued his plans of conscientious economy, and passed on. Many months elapsed, and still there appeared no alteration in his resolutions of amendment. He was a good workman, and with his better habits he recovered his former extensive and profitable employment. Everything seemed to promise comfort and respectability. I have little more to add, and that shall be told quickly. I had one evening met Pat Connell as he returned from his work, and as usual, after a mutual and on his side respectful salutation, I spoke a few words of encouragement and approval. I left him industrious, active, healthy. When I next saw him, not 3 days after, he was a corpse. The circumstances which marked the event of his death were somewhat strange, I might say fearful. The unfortunate man had accidentally met an old friend just returned after a long absence, and in a moment of excitement, forgetting everything in the warmth of his joy, he yielded to his urgent invitation to accompany him into a public house, which lay close by the spot where the encounter had taken place. Connell, however, previously to entering the room, had announced his determination to take nothing more than the strictest temperance would warrant. But oh, who can describe the inveterate tenacity with which a drunkard's habits cling to him through life? He may repent, he may reform, he may look with actual abhorrence upon his past profligacy, but amid all this reformation and compunction, who can tell the moment in which the base and ruinous propensity might not recur, triumphing over resolution, remorse, shame, everything, and prostrating its victim once more in all that is destructive and revolting in that fatal vice? The wretched man left the place in a state of utter intoxication. He was brought home nearly insensible, and placed in his bed. The younger part of the family retired to rest much after their usual hour, but the poor wife remained up, sitting by the fire, too much grieved and shocked at the occurrence of what she had so little expected to settle to rest. Fatigue, however, at length overcame her, and she sank gradually into an uneasy slumber. She could not tell how long she had remained in this state, but when she awakened, and immediately on opening her eyes, she perceived by the faint red light of the smouldering turf embers 2 persons, one of whom she recognized as her husband, noiselessly gliding out of the room.
"Pat, darling, where are you going?"
said she. There was no answer. The door closed after them, but in a moment she was startled and terrified by a loud and heavy crash, as if some ponderous body had been hurled down the stair. Much alarmed, she started up, and going to the head of the staircase she called repeatedly upon her husband, but in vain. She returned to the room, and with the assistance of her daughter, whom I had occasion to mention before, she succeeded in finding and lighting a candle, with which she hurried again to the head of the staircase. At the bottom lay what seemed to be a bundle of clothes, heaped together, motionless, lifeless. It was her husband. In going down the stairs, for what purpose can never be known, he had fallen helplessly and violently to the bottom, and coming head foremost, the spine of the neck had been dislocated by the shock, and instant death must have ensued. The body lay upon that landing-place to which his dream had referred. It is scarcely worth endeavouring to clear up a single point in a narrative where all is mystery. Yet I could not help suspecting that the second figure which had been seen in the room by Connell's wife on the night of his death might have been no other than his own shadow. I suggested the solution of the difficulty, but she told me that the unknown person had been considerably in advance of her husband, and on reaching the door, had turned back as if to communicate something to his companion. It was then a mystery. Was the dream verified? Whither had the disembodied spirit sped? Who can say? We know not. But I left the house of death that day in a state of horror which I could not describe. It seemed to me that I was scarce awake. I heard and saw everything as if under the spell of a nightmare. The coincidence was terrible.
The End.
The Brain in the Jar by Norman L. Wood Hammerstrom and R. F. Seawright. For the 5th time in less than an hour, the call bell clanged noisily. Automatically, Vern Eldridge, the orderly, rose from his chair and slipped silently down the dim-lit corridor of the old Berlin hospital. Merely another fretful patient demanding attention, Eldridge sighed. He possessed an adventure-loving soul and a capacity for daring which, during the war, had helped make him one of the most trusted and efficient members of the American Intelligence Department, and which naturally enough chafed mightily under the monotony of his present forced inaction. Not but that his position even now was sufficiently dangerous. Eldridge was well aware that he had escaped the Wilhelmstrasse agents by what seemed a miracle. He knew that as long as they believed him to be in Germany, and thus far there had been absolutely no opportunity for escape, they would be constantly on the alert for his capture and arrest. Though the armistice had been signed, Eldridge well knew that one who had done so much as himself toward the downfall of the Kaiser's forces would have earned the private vengeance of the imperialists. Even now he was convinced from certain veiled remarks that Dr. Yeager, the physician in charge, suspected his secret. Eldridge was treading on very thin ice and was fully aware of the fact. He had been employed as orderly in the hospital for nearly 2 months now, posing as a wounded German soldier of whose papers he had possessed himself, and he knew that it was only a matter of time before the ruse would be discovered. It was well into March of 1919. The night was cold and foggy, and fitful gusts of rain were dashed against the windows by the high wind which had come up at sunset. The gale moaned and shrieked among the towers and turrets of the ancient pile, which trembled slightly under the heavier shocks. A fitting night for murder and crime of all sorts, thought the impressionable Eldridge, as he sleepily made his way back to his room. As he approached the stairs leading to the basement, he perceived Dr. Yeager himself standing beside them in a rather listless attitude. Although it was 3 o'clock in the morning, it was nothing unusual for the famous scientist and research worker to keep even later hours in his private laboratory. At present, he was standing relaxed, smoking a cigarette, and no doubt planning his next day's research program. A slender, erect man of medium height was the doctor, with sharp, strong features accentuated by a neatly trimmed black beard. Rumors were afloat in scientific circles regarding certain experiments successfully carried out by Yeager in the preservation of living tissues in special liquids, although as yet he had given out nothing to the world. The doctor had previously come into renown from several chemical innovations pertaining to the composition of some of the poison gases used by the German armies, which he had perfected during the war. At present, his position at the hospital was a sinecure, to aid him in carrying on extensive investigations in tissue preservation. So much Eldridge knew from the report of a fellow operative, since deceased. From his own observation, he knew Yeager to be a cold, hard man, utterly without scruples, and having a deep vein of cruelty in his nature, which manifested itself from time to time in various characteristic acts. As Eldridge passed, the doctor gave him a short "good morning" and turned to descend the stairs. Doubtless, thought Eldridge, he was going to the basement for chemicals, having perhaps run out of some compound needed to complete the experiment which had kept him working so late. Eldridge passed on and was turning down the corridor leading to his own room when, above the roar of the wind and steady beat of the rain, a door slammed loudly. For a moment he failed to perceive its significance. Then he pulled up sharply and listened, for it dawned upon his sleepy mind that the noise had come from behind a door which he had always supposed to open on a fire escape. This was curious indeed, and his mind became instantly alert as he realized the possible significance of his discovery. His professional training and natural curiosity overcoming his caution, Eldridge stepped to the door and turned the knob. The door proved to be unlocked, and he entered quickly, closing it behind him. He found himself in a narrow hallway, lit dimly by a single bulb in the ceiling. Fully resolved now to investigate the mystery of this part of the building, Eldridge passed quickly to the end of the corridor, where he found it turned sharply to the left. A few yards farther on, he arrived at a second door, doubtless, he thought, the one which had slammed. He opened it cautiously and slipped in, the draught closing it after him. He was in a fairly large room, filled up as a laboratory. A drop light on one of the two large tables cast a circle of bright light over the table, leaving the rest of the room in deep shadow. As his eyes became accustomed to the shaded light, he saw the place was lined with shelves holding row above row of chemical supplies, as well as numerous glass containers of various sizes and shapes. These latter were filled with liquids in which floated in perfect preservation various parts of the human anatomy. The tables were littered with retorts, test tubes, Bunsen burners, microscopes, surgical and dissecting instruments. In fact, all the varied paraphernalia of the research chemist and physiologist. On the left was a small anteroom, and beside it, and projecting partly in front of its doorway, was a large cage containing several full-grown guinea pigs. An expensive X-ray outfit and various photographic apparatus stood in one corner. It flashed on Eldridge's mind that he had stumbled on the private laboratory of Dr. Yeager. He had never known the exact location of this room, and the doctor always entered it from his private office, which he invariably kept locked during his absence. No doubt, thought the spy, the anteroom led to the office. He quickly realized that his presence here was not without considerable danger. for the scientist would hardly have taken such elaborate precautions in regard to the privacy of his laboratory had he not had something to conceal. Eldridge began to feel decidedly nervous. The violently raging elements without did not help to dispel this feeling. He almost decided to retire and leave his investigation for a more favorable time when his attention was arrested by a large glass jar resting on a shelf above the rows of drugs and chemicals on the right wall. It caught his eye first through the elaborate apparatus connected with it, then by its contents. The jar was spherical in shape, with a large circular mouth fitted with a ground glass stopper, having a German cross for a knob. Above was a large nickel-plated tank, and extending from it to the jar in a slender glass tube controlled by a system of valves. Another tube, also fitted with valves, projected from the jar close to the base, disappearing into the wall. Both tubes were fitted with delicate thermometers. Eldridge observed most of these details later. At present, his attention was riveted upon the contents of the jar, which seemed to consist of a purple-black fluid. As he stared, the hue gradually changed to a deep red and slowly became clear. Then, in the depths of the jar, the amazed spy beheld two glowing red spots, gleaming through the murky liquid like the eyes of a wolf in the dark. Then, as the fluid became perfectly transparent, he saw what appeared to be two naked human eyes glaring down at him with ferocious intensity. He fell back aghast, staring in amazement at this phenomenon, and as he looked, the liquid slowly resumed its former opacity, till it had regained the original purple-black hue. Then it again grew transparent, and the whole phenomenon was repeated. 3 times Eldridge witnessed this curious change. Then, gathering his courage, he climbed up on the table nearer to the jar so that he was but a few feet from it, with his eyes on the same level. As the liquid cleared once more, he saw a human brain in perfect preservation, resting on a soft membranous cushion. The cushion lay on a glass pedestal which projected about halfway up from the bottom of the jar. Extending from the brain were 2 cords which crossed each other and dropped to the bottom of the jar, terminating in the 2 human eyes that Eldridge had first seen in the semi-darkness of the laboratory. The hideous spectacle resembled a huge snail. Eldridge had lost track of the time since entering the strange and sinister laboratory of Dr. Yeager, but now his subconscious alert senses detected the sound of a door slamming far down the outer corridor. It must be the doctor returning from the basement, Eldridge thought, and he hastily slipped from the table and out into the narrow hallway, being careful this time that the door did not slam. As he reached the door opening into the outer corridor, he heard footsteps rapidly approaching, and slipped behind the door just as the doctor entered. Yeager closed the door without a backward glance and hurried down the corridor. He passed the corner without turning his head, but Eldridge waited until he heard the sound of the laboratory door closing, and then hurried to his room. What he had witnessed in Dr. Yeager's secret laboratory had made a deep impression upon Eldridge, but it was some time before he had another opportunity to visit the weird room. The doctor always kept both doors locked, and doubtless only the late hour and his intention to return at once had caused him to relax his vigilance on the night Eldridge made his first visit. Furthermore, he was nearly always there in person, working on his endless experiments. But finally, after nearly 3 weeks, Yeager was called to Carlsbad for a consultation, and Eldridge realized that his chance for closer investigation had come. He waited until after midnight. Then, making sure that he was not observed, he unlocked the doors with skeleton keys and entered the laboratory. He found it very much as he had left it on his previous visit, except that the place was in total darkness. He located the switch by means of his pocket flash and turned on the table drop light. He had ascertained after his first visit that the room contained no windows that might show the illumination to anyone passing by outside, and in view of the doctor's absence, he thought himself fairly safe from interruption. He had brought a pad of paper and a pencil, and now seated himself on the table in order to bring his eyes nearer to the level of the jar, and proceeded to make a rapid sketch of the jar and its contents. As he was putting the final touches to the drawing, he had a distinct and vivid impression that his name had been called. His auditory nerves had registered nothing, of that he was certain, but the impression was too real to be lightly dismissed. He glanced nervously about, but no other living thing was present, aside from the guinea pigs in their cage. Again came that vivid impression of his name being pronounced. He looked up to see the glaring eyes of the brain, fading gradually from sight as the liquid in the jar grew opaque. As he stared, the fluid again regained its transparency, and the glowing eyes seemed to be boring through his very brain. His head swam. He clutched at the table for support and then lost consciousness. He returned to his senses as from a black void, with all the mental sensations of emerging from ether. He had no means of telling the length of time that had passed during his trance, but glancing at his watch he saw that it was only a little after 1 o'clock, so he concluded that it must have been brief. Then, looking down at his sketch, he saw a line in French written across the bottom in his own handwriting. He was considerably surprised, not to say alarmed, and with a final glance at the eyes, now disappearing into the liquid, he turned to the door. Suddenly he stopped with a gasp of terror. Suspended motionless in thin air before his eyes hung an empty test tube. As he shrank back, the tube dropped and crashed to pieces on the floor. Retaining only enough presence of mind to switch out the light, Eldridge ran from the laboratory, more frightened by this than by any other of the phenomenon which he had witnessed. Translated, the message on his sketch proved to read, "Be in the laboratory tomorrow at midnight." Brief and to the point, thought Eldridge, and he gave much thought during the day to the curious communication. He saw Dr. Yeager returning from his consultation late in the afternoon, and with some misgivings he repaired to the laboratory at midnight, armed with an automatic. He found the room empty. Yeager, tired by his journey, had retired early. Seated again before the brain, the spy soon passed into a hypnotic trance precisely similar to the one he had undergone the night before. He emerged as on the previous occasion as if from a black void, and looking down at his tablet, found that several sheets were closely covered with his handwriting in French. He hastened to his room and began to translate the script. As he proceeded, horror and amazement at the gruesome tale halted him again and again, but he finally completed the task, and the whole weird story lay before him. In the name of the dictator, he recognized that of a famous French spy who had disappeared just before the signing of the armistice. "My name is Jean Perrin," read the script. "Possibly you have heard of me, Mr. Eldridge, for with all modesty I may say that my work did a great deal toward the downfall of the German forces. When I was finally captured and exposed on November 5th of last year, the Wilhelmstrasse officials swore vengeance upon me, peace or no peace. But I knew that my work was well done, and that the end of the war could be but a few days off. Colonel von Ullman, head of the Secret Service, had me brought before him for a private interview in which he tried to extract from me full details regarding the extent of the information I had managed to furnish our leaders. Colonel von Ullman failed utterly in his purpose, and it enraged him to such an extent that he swore I should die on the day the war ended. I bowed mockingly as I left his presence, but though I never saw him again, he kept his word. All was bustle and confusion preceding the great day, but when it dawned, it brought with it a dead quiet which told me, in solitary confinement better than any words could have done, that the thing we had waited and worked and died for during more than 4 long years had at last been accomplished. For safer keeping, I was confined not in the Berlin prison, but in a small room in a turret of the old castle of Prince Otto von Machstein, just outside Berlin. 2 armed guards stood without my door day and night, and my food was passed to me through a small side window in the door. They were taking no chances with Jean Perrin. It is with a little pardonable pride that I recall how carefully they watched me, and their conversation outside my door, which showed how they feared my escape. And it was to good purpose for them. Much as I plotted carefully as I searched my mind, There was no possible chance for freedom in the limited time given me. The great day of the armistice found me still a prisoner. Late that night, a guard of 8 came clanking down the corridor, their heavy boots raising echoes throughout the old castle. Their leader, a heavy-set, brutal-faced sergeant, unlocked the door for the first time in nearly a week and confronted me with an evil grin on his seared countenance. Perhaps he knew of the fate in store for me. I think so now. I made no resistance as they handcuffed my wrists and led me from the castle. In silence, we entered an armored car, and after an hour or more of rapid driving, arrived at this hospital. Through the long, dimly lit corridors, the clanking guard preceded and followed me, and finally we reached the operating room. The light was poor here, as elsewhere in the building, but in the center of the room stood the operating table, illumined by a cold blue cone of light from the powerful electric lamp overhead. The room seemed filled with doctors and nurses, shrouded in white, and at the head of the table stood an instrument tray covered with the glittering paraphernalia of the surgeon. Ah, I shudder as I recall those fearful moments. I was seized and overpowered, for handcuffed as I was, my resistance was feeble. Stripped of my clothes and attired in an antiseptic white gown, I was thrown upon the table and my hands and feet strapped to its legs. My head was strapped down, and then Dr. Yeager, a cruel smile on his face. He had not yet donned his operating mask like the others, though otherwise in full operating attire, stepped up and addressed me. Oh, the horror of what that snake-blooded demon told me. It rings in my ears even now when I am past all caring. He told me of his successful experiments in keeping alive, in his special fluids, various parts of the human body. And I was to be the subject of his crowning experiment, an attempt to keep the human brain alive and functioning. Can you imagine the horror of that scene to me, a living normal man? Can you picture that dim room, its atmosphere heavy with the odors of disinfectants and anesthetics, with the white-robed figures of doctors and nurses, shrouded to the eyes, flitting about silently as ghosts as they prepared the instruments and anesthetics for this frightful crime? It was almost more than the human mind could endure, and I nearly lost my self-control. Then I read the meaning of the evil grin on Dr. Yeager's face and knew that he was waiting for me to break down and beg for mercy. What pleasure so exquisite for him as to refuse it and perhaps make the torture worse in some way for the mere pleasure of gloating over my suffering? I gritted my teeth and swore that no cry, no sign of quailing, would they wring from me. Dr. Yeager stared long and piercingly into my eyes. What he saw there must have convinced him of my determination, for he made an abrupt sign of disgust and gave the order for the anesthetic. I held myself rigid and taut as the ether nozzle was placed over my nose and mouth, shutting out from my lungs forever the oxygen that gives life. But I breathed deeply of the lethal fumes, for oblivion was heaven after that scene of hell. I shall never know, I suppose, just how long my consciousness was suspended. I did not think it was more than a few days, but again it may have been weeks. My first sensations were too frightful for description. I can give but a poor idea of the agony I endured, but it was all in one place, seemingly within my cranium. Alas, I did not know then that my cranium was reduced to ashes. 1,000,000 demons might have been stabbing at my brain with red-hot needles. Darkness, a terrible roaring were all about. Is this the end, I thought? Am I in the abode of the damned? For the torture of those moments seemed to me impossible, except in the place taught by the faith of my childhood to be the final home of evil. Thought, concentration were impossible. I have only the memory of the sensations. The noise increased, grew unbearable. A cracking, shrieking roar, mounting higher and higher, seemed about to split the eardrums I no longer had. Then oblivion for another indeterminate period. With returning consciousness, the symptoms gradually subsided. and at length I was able to observe an alternate change of light to darkness, and darkness to light, occurring about once every 2 minutes. During the light periods, I became able to distinguish objects, and slowly I regained my normal power of vision. I saw that I was in a large and fully equipped laboratory, the room in which you are sitting tonight. But what was my horror to perceive in a mirror on the opposite wall, not myself as I had been in life, but this glass jar wherein you see me, and within it my own brain and eyeballs attached thereto by their nerve cords. And then I knew that Jaeger's accursed experiment had succeeded. My living brain, was functioning in his liquid. Far better, I thought, had death claimed me. From then on, I lived in a world devoid of all sensations of sound, odor, or feeling. My first terrible agonies had been due to the irritation of the ends of the severed spinal cord and sensory nerves. Nothing was left me now but my sense of sight, thanks to the surgical skill of that ingenious fiend. The eternal silence was oppressive, maddening. I prayed for death in vain, for I possessed no material body with which to execute self-destruction. My mind and personality were helplessly chained to this lump of clay called the brain. Then I found something to live for. Every day the doctor comes to work long hours at his experiments, sometimes with chemicals, test tubes, and retorts, sometimes with tissue and microscopes, or again with strange photographic apparatus. And every night before he leaves, he comes and stares at me for many minutes. He knows that the tissue of my brain lives, but as yet he has found no way of determining whether or not it functions. And it pleases me to keep him in ignorance, for the day of my vengeance is very near. That is what I have found to live for. I have learned a great deal since my incarceration here, among other things, that Dr. Jaeger, whatever may be his nature and personal character, is one of the world's great scientists, a specialist in many things, in all of which he excels. I have learned, too, something of the manner in which I am kept alive here. The tube leading into the jar from above connects with the nickel tank, which contains a supply of the secret fluid. The valves are arranged to let the fluid pass very slowly through the jar, finding egress through the lower valves and out through the tube which they control. The liquid is nutritious and at body temperature. A subtle, periodic chemical reaction causes the color change, designed to protect my naked eyes from the light. Beyond the fact that the fluid has a chemical similarity to human blood and contains a colorless compound carrying oxygen, I have no knowledge of its composition. But I have learned much more than this. With nothing to do, week after week, I have worked at the one thing that was left to me. I have developed my willpower. From the will of an ordinary man, I have increased its strength till my powers now would astound any psychologist, even those who suspect the possibilities of the human will. And I have used it to the harm of the enemy. Though my only aim now is my personal vengeance on Jaeger. In the last weeks, there have been 12 murders, 6 suicides, and 8 insanity cases, all of noted German officials of the worst type. Among them was Colonel von Ullmann. These acts were all caused by the hypnotic suggestions which I have made by telepathy. And I have advanced even farther than this. I have done what has never been accomplished before. Today my will is so highly developed that by simply exerting it, I can move small objects. The suspended flask you saw last night was a demonstration. Were I to continue, the time would come soon when nothing would be impossible for me. My powers would be such that I might rule the world through strength of will. But I have no desire for that. Existence is misery, and when I have accomplished my revenge, I shall be glad to leave life, in earnest this time. It is by means of my telepathic power that I have thrown you into the hypnotic trance which now claims you, and using your hand I have written down my story. If you would witness my vengeance on Dr. Jaeger, conceal yourself in the small room behind the guinea pig cage tomorrow night. Be there by 9 o'clock, as Jaeger, whose mind I read, will come soon after. Thus ended a manuscript which surpassed by far in grisly horror, gruesome detail, and stark improbability anything that Eldridge had ever imagined possible. He passed the day as though in a trance, his mind running constantly on the extraordinary communication. He had no doubts, after the first natural questionings of his mind, as to the authenticity of the strange message. And so 9 o'clock found him concealed as directed, with his automatic ready. He had not been long hidden when Dr. Jaeger entered from his office, and without looking around set about his work. He began slicing, for microscopic examination, tissue from a living human arm taken from one of the jars. A half hour or more passed, broken only by an occasional cough or exclamation of satisfaction from the doctor as the examination proceeded. Apparently to his complete satisfaction. Eldridge did not grow impatient. The uncanny affair held him enthralled. Then a slight movement above the doctor's head caught his eye. For the first time he noticed a huge wax bottle of hydrofluoric acid on a shelf directly over that section of the table whereon the scientist was engaged. Jaeger had been using the deadly stuff for certain silicon determinations of the tissue. Again the slight movement, and now Eldridge saw that it was this bottle sliding forward a few inches. Slowly, all but imperceptibly, so as not to alarm the worker below, it slid forward toward the edge of the shelf. Unconsciously, Eldridge estimated the distance it must fall to reach the doctor, some 5 or 6 feet. Involuntarily, he was tempted to warn the unsuspecting physician, but the glittering eyes of the brain seemed to render his will powerless. The bottle was now projecting some inches beyond the edge of the shelf. Eldridge started to cry out, but found himself unable to speak. He tried to rise, but was unable to move a muscle. Suddenly the doctor looked up, perhaps warned by some premonition of his impending doom. If so, it came too late. Into his eyes came the look of a hunted animal as he saw the jar of deadly acid poised directly over his head. The bottle came hurtling downward as he started to rise and struck him full in the face, smashing to bits, while the acid gushed over his body. He fell to the floor, writhing and shrieking in his death agony. The vengeance of Jean Perrin was accomplished. Meanwhile, the acid vigorously attacked the woodwork and glassware, and flames soon sprang up from the heat of the reaction. A bottle of sodium exploded, and row after row of bottles came crashing down, their chemical contents adding fuel and impetus to the flames. Eldridge's escape by the corridor had been cut off from the first, and the scene held him fascinated. He made no attempt to leave through the doctor's office, as he might have done at first. His present position had become one of great danger, owing to the explosive nature of some of the chemicals which had not yet been touched by the flames. The laboratory was rapidly becoming a raging inferno. High above all stood the jar and its contents which had brought this thing to pass. The red eyes of the brain glittered triumphantly through the smoke and flames. Jaeger had become motionless. Then, suddenly, the shelf gave way and the brain and jar crashed into the fire and disappeared. Long tongues of flame shot up to the very ceiling. Then came a bursting roar. A flying bottle struck Eldridge on the temple, and oblivion descended. When Eldridge returned to consciousness, he found himself swathed in bandages on board a hospital ship bound for New York. His wife was with him, also his friend and co-worker Felton of the Secret Service, who, with a detachment sent from the American Army of Occupation, had effected his rescue from the burning hospital. To them he related his weird tale, and with shattered nerves and seared body resigned himself to his wife's loving care. Her love alone can efface from his mind the effects of the memory of the vengeance of the brain in the jar.